You weren't raised by the internet. You were raised by silence. And that single difference may explain more about Gen X than any stereotype ever could. Because long before people were addicted to notifications, you learned how to live without hearing from anyone for days. Long before social media rewarded being seen, you became comfortable being invisible. The strange part? The world calls that independence. Psychology calls it something far more complicated. Picture this. It's 3:37 in the afternoon. The school bus pulls away. You walk up the driveway with a key hanging around your neck. You unlock the front door. The house is quiet. No text messages, no parents asking how your day went, no one reminding you to do homework. Just the hum of the refrigerator, a television somewhere in the background, and a few hours where you had to figure life out on your own. That scene played out millions of times across America. It became so common that people even gave those kids a nickname, latchkey kids. But almost nobody stopped to ask the bigger question. What happens when a child repeatedly learns, I have to take care of myself? At first, not much. You make a sandwich, watch TV, do your homework, but your brain is paying attention. It isn't just learning routines, it's learning rules. Rules about people, rules about safety, rules about trust. Without realizing it, your nervous system begins writing a quiet story. If I need something, I'll handle it myself. And the strange thing about stories written in childhood is that we keep reading them long after we've forgotten who wrote them. Maybe that's why so many Gen X adults seem almost impossible to read. You're dependable, calm, practical. You don't make every inconvenience into a crisis. You don't announce every emotion online. People admire that, but admiration often hides misunderstanding because what looks like strength from the outside can sometimes be a survival strategy that never got turned off. Here's something most people never notice. Human beings don't simply remember painful experiences. We remember the behaviors that helped us survive them. If keeping your emotions to yourself once protected you, your brain quietly files that behavior under one word, safe. And once the brain labels something as safe, it becomes incredibly difficult to let it go, even if your life has completely changed. Imagine carrying an umbrella every single day because it rained throughout your childhood. Eventually, you stop checking the forecast. The umbrella no longer protects you from the weather. It becomes part of your identity. Psychological habits work exactly the same way. You don't consciously choose them. You simply wake up one day and realize they've been choosing you. Now, here's where Gen X becomes fascinating. You grew up in one world and built your adult life in another. You remember rotary phones, cassette tapes, handwritten directions, Saturday morning cartoons. You watched the internet arrive. You watched smartphones change human attention. You watched social media transform identity into performance. Most generations only adapted to one major revolution. You adapted to several, quietly, without asking for applause. Think about that for a second. The world changed faster during your lifetime than during almost any other generation in modern history. And somehow, you kept moving. New technology? Learn it. Economic recession? Figure it out. Industry disappears? Start over. Again and again. People often mistake this for emotional toughness, but psychology suggests something slightly different. Repeated adaptation creates a brain that expects change. It learns flexibility. It becomes remarkably good at surviving uncertainty. That's one of Gen X's greatest hidden strengths. But every strength casts a shadow. When you've spent decades adapting, you rarely ask yourself a simple question. What have I been adapting away from? How many dreams quietly became responsibilities? How many conversations ended with, it's fine, even when it wasn't? How many times did you decide that carrying everything alone was simply easier than explaining what you felt? Maybe that's why younger generations sometimes misunderstand Gen X. They see emotional distance. They don't see emotional discipline. They see skepticism. They don't see experience. Because skepticism wasn't something you were born with. It was earned. You watched companies promise loyalty, then lay off thousands. You watched institutions change. You watched certainty disappear. Optimism didn't vanish. It evolved into caution, into observation, into waiting for actions instead of believing words. There's a reason many Gen X adults can spot manipulation surprisingly quickly. You've seen too many versions of it already. But here's the psychological twist almost nobody talks about. The same brain that becomes excellent at detecting disappointment can accidentally overlook hope. Not because hope isn't there, because your brain becomes more interested in preventing pain than discovering possibility. That's how survival works. It prioritizes protection over exploration. protection over connection, protection over vulnerability, which raises an uncomfortable question. What if some of the walls that once protected you are now keeping out the very relationships you've spent your life wanting? That's the paradox of Gen X. You mastered independence so completely that dependence began to feel unfamiliar, sometimes even unsafe. Yet the strongest people aren't the ones who never lean on anyone. They're the ones who know the difference between needing no one and pretending they don't. Here's the truth history may eventually remember about your generation. You weren't loud enough to dominate the headlines. You weren't large enough to dominate the demographics. But you became the bridge between two civilizations, the last generation to remember an analog childhood and the first to build a digital adulthood. You speak both languages, the language of patience and the language of speed, the language of handwritten letters and instant messages, the language of privacy and permanent visibility. That isn't just a historical coincidence. It's a psychological superpower, because the future belongs to people who can adapt without forgetting who they are. And you've been practicing that your entire life. So maybe the greatest lesson Gen X still has left to learn isn't how to survive. You've already proven that. Maybe it's understanding that survival was never supposed to become your permanent personality, because there comes a moment when strength stops meaning carrying everything alone and starts meaning allowing someone else to carry a piece of it with you. After all, the child who once unlocked an empty house with a small key deserves to discover that not every door in life has to be opened alone.